way that folks typically describe me is Shawn is the guy that combines everything air quality and transportation. So if it has to do with alternative fuels, that usually works through me. If it's about transportation conformity, which there are a few people in the room that know what that crazy process looks like, that also goes through me. But the largest part of what I do, probably 137% of my time over the last couple years, has been focusing on Volkswagen Environmental Mitigation Trust Program. So let's see what the first slide is, because I've done so many different programs in so many different places. Is everybody more or less familiar with what Volkswagen is and how we got here by now? Okay, so we're not going to spend a lot of time on that. The majority of my time, as I said, I'm working on either Volkswagen, or we have another program that we operate out of the same shop called Dieselwise Indiana, and that's kind of my diesel emission reduction program. One of the benefits that folks in Indiana have, it's a benefit for you all, it's not so much a benefit for me probably, is I'm pretty much a one-man shop. So if there are questions, comments, concerns, whatever, you call me and you'll get a response. You'll get some, whether you like the response or not, depends, but you will get a response. It may not be instant, but it will be a response. So you're not going to get lost in bureaucracy between who's actually going to answer that. So we've talked a little bit about, we all know what Volkswagen is, how we got here. So today we're really going to focus on the 2019 request for proposals. We posted the 2019 Volkswagen Mitigation Trust request for proposals in kind of mid-March. It is open until June-ish. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Let's go ahead and bump past this slide. These are the things we're going to talk about. My media folks like me to have those on there. That sort of overview of what we're going to talk about. I'd just rather go to what we're going to talk about. So the applications are due to IDEM no later than June 17th of 2019. And I only highlight that. I'm going to hit the other key parts of the slide also. But that is the next thing that you really need to know about. Is June 17 of this year, we need applications at IDEM through a specific email address that we'll talk about in a bit. So for those who remember, the state of Indiana was awarded $41 million roughly through the Mitigation Trust. And we broke that $41 million down into a variety of things. So the first thing we did was, one of the components that was allowable and eligible under the program was to develop a light-duty electric vehicle infrastructure program. States were allowed to pull off 15% off the top and set that aside for light-duty EV infrastructure. Like most states around us, Indiana and our Volkswagen committee said, yes, let's carve out that 15%, so we're going to take that off the top and we're going to work on that at some point soon. Then we looked at everything that was left and kind of carved out how that's going to sort of play itself out. The program, as it's set up within the trust, does not allow a beneficiary, and IDEM is the beneficiary representing the state of Indiana, which means we are the ones with the legal obligations and the legal accountability for this program. There is a Volkswagen committee that folks have heard of as well. We work in partnership with the Volkswagen committee on some key milestones and decision points along the way. Ultimately, IDEM is the beneficiary, and that the accountability will mostly reside there. So the beneficiaries are only allowed to pull down no more than 1/3 of the available funds per year. The intent of that was they didn't want every single beneficiary, call them states for the most part, they didn't want every single state to say, hey, we want to take our $2.7 billion now combined, and then Volkswagen goes bankrupt. So the logic was, if we break it down into at least 3, it's a little easier financially for folks to handle. So what you see here in round 1 is kind of a 1/3 representation of what we envision the program is likely to look like for the next 3 cycles. It could change a little bit depending upon how round 1 goes. So roughly, we'll call it $10 million, $9.83 million is going to be available in this round of funding. And of that 9.83, 4.26 is available for class 4 through 8 on-road vehicles. And one of the things, we kind of grouped vehicles into on-road and non-road, or vehicles and equipment into some more general categories to make it a little bit easier, because if anybody has read Appendix D2, it's really kind of convoluted. We tried to simplify it where we could. So 4.26 for your basic on-road vehicles. You'll see parenthetically excluding school buses, because when we did a lot of the outreach as we were developing the beneficiary mitigation plan, we found that folks across the state from the river to the lake really felt that some funds should be set aside for the school bus sector. So in having those conversations and looking at what we saw in some of our survey responses also, we ultimately decided we would carve out $1.99 million for non-electric powered school buses and $850,000 for electric powered school buses. So this is just for this round. And then the remaining $2.73 million will go for non-road equipment and vehicles. We've set kind of the floor and the ceiling on the grant amounts, the floor being somewhere in the range of $50,000, the ceiling being somewhere in the range of $2 million. If there are really, really stellar projects that you all know of that are $48,000 projects, encourage them to apply. I've had historically, I have seen that floor as something that we shoot for when possible, but if there's a really good project, we want to give that project an opportunity. In one previous diesel-wise round, as an example, and this is sort of the mentality that we're operating under, the minimum at that point, I believe, was $25,000, and I funded a $2,600 low rolling resistance tire project to an applicant who wrote the application on legal paper, handwritten, and sent it in. If they couldn't get these funds, their business was going under. It was a completely eligible project, other than it fell below the ceiling. We felt this was a fantastic opportunity to do something very special for some Indiana citizens that needed our help. So we funded that project. The $2 million, the top end, it's probably going to be a little bit of a harder cap. So keep that in mind. We talked about the June 17, and you'll see it says most projects are expected to be completed by December of 2020. We already have learned through our latest round of Dieselwise Indiana that as these Volkswagen funds hit the street across the nation, and you know, we've got vendors in the room that can probably testify to this, things are not going to happen as quickly as they used to. So what used to be a 6-month turnover for, say, a refuse hauler, it may be 12, 16, 18 months now. We recognize that. That's why we're saying, yeah, our target is the end of December 2020, but if things happen, things happen. We're very reasonable in that regard. Next slide. So who are the eligible grant applicants? Well, for the most part, if you own a piece of diesel equipment or a diesel vehicle that is a medium or heavy duty vehicle, class 4 through 8, you're almost certainly eligible in some way or another. Whether you're public or private, you would be eligible. I think everybody knows what public and private is in this room. We're going to bounce to the next slide. So the type of equipment that we're talking about here are class 4 through 8 medium and heavy duty trucks, class 4 through 8 buses. Now, pre-tier 3 ferry, tugboat, marine engines, probably not real relevant to this area, but pre-tier 4 freight switcher locomotives may very well be. It's been a long time since I've lived up here. How many rail yards are in sort of the Fort Wayne area? Anybody? So that's cool.
One major, maybe.
What'd you say?
Do you have any in your area? Norfolk Southern. Yeah, Norfolk Southern. New Haven is probably the biggest.
So that would be an area where that category of pre-tier 4 freight switchers may be relevant. Pre-tier 3 airport ground support equipment. This is actually a new addition. We've not actually had the opportunity to fund ground support equipment in the past. That is eligible under this program also. I know you guys have a fantastic airport here. I've flown out of it a couple times myself. And then forklifts and port cargo handling equipment also eligible under this program as long as it's at least 8,000 pounds lift capacity. It's important to note on that piece though, it is port cargo handling equipment. It is not in the state of Indiana. The state of Indiana is not loosely interpreting the mitigation trust language to say distribution warehouses are the same as a port. We are saying a port is a port is a port. And most states around us are kind of following that as well. Next slide, thank you. So we talked a little bit about how we sort of group these things into on-road and non-road. So we'll start with some of our on-road opportunities here. So class 4 through 8 medium or heavy duty trucks, these have to be model year 1992 through 2009. If they fall in that model year, if you want to do a repower with non-electric, the program would cover up to 40%. If you want to do a repower with electric, if it's an option for you, the program could cover up to 75%. Replacements, total vehicle replacements, as opposed to just repowering it, kind of the same approach. Non-electric, we would cover up to 25% through the program. Non-electric drayage trucks, once again, that's kind of a port scenario there, but where those are applicable, 50% up to. And then if it happens to be an electric replacement, the program would cover or could cover up to 75%. Class 4 through 8 school buses, shuttle buses, transit buses. You'll notice the model years here are different. For buses, for whatever reason, when the mitigation trust was written, it did not have a bottom cap. It only had a top. So where you see 92 to 09 being the range up there, you're talking 2009 and older here. So a little bit more flexibility there potentially. And we'll talk a little bit, I think, about turnover cycle and how that fits into the program, because I've got a lot of questions about that over the last couple weeks. So I want to touch on that here in a bit. And then as far as the funding levels, the repowers, if it's non-electric 40, if it's electric 75, if it's a replacement of a school bus, the program would cover up to 25% for non-electric school buses, shuttle buses or transit buses, and up to 75% if they happen to be electric. Pre-tier 4 switcher locomotives. With locomotives, they have to be operated a minimum of 1,000 hours per year. That actually kind of applies to most of the non-road sector. They need to be operated 1,000 hours per year. The funding scenarios, repowering them, which is a little more logical in the non-road section in some cases than it is the on-road. If it's non-electric, up to 40%. If it's electric, up to 75%. And then replacement, kind of that same range, 25% if it's not electric, 75% if it happens to be electric. There are some pretty interesting hybrid electric options out there in the locomotive industry right now. Pre-tier 3 ferry and tugboats. We're going to go ahead and just bounce past that because y'all don't have ferries and tugs up here. Airport ground equipment, you'll see same thing. It needs to be pre-tier 3. Now, when you say pre-tier 3, that's because that is the expectation that that's what it's going to go to, okay? Once again, they have to be operated over 1,000 hours per year. Here's where things are a little bit different in this sector, if you will, within the eligibility of the Volkswagen Mitigation Trust itself. You'll see it's all electric only. So whether you repower or replace GSE equipment, it would cover up to 75%, but it has to be an electric replacement. That is just the language of the mitigation trust. That is what the mitigation trust has found eligible. The other side of that non-road sector, the 8,000-pound lift capacity forklifts and port cargo handling stuff, they've got to be located in Indiana ports, over 1,000 hours per year, and the same 75 and 75. As far as what the program could cover as a maximum. So some of the key things that folks need to be aware of anytime we're talking about a vehicle or equipment replacement requirement, if you're looking to replace something, this is what's going to have to happen to that something that currently exists. First of all, a replacement project will require that it's the same type and similar GVWR or horsepower of the existing vehicle. So what we're talking about here is you can't replace a 300 horsepower piece with a 500 horsepower piece. However, we are willing to look at scenarios where you may be running a 500 horsepower piece and you know you can do the same work in the same location in the same way with a 300 horsepower piece. So when you look at that sort of requirement, understand that you can't go up, but we're open to hearing if you can go down, because obviously that's a better environment for you, probably lower fuel usage and a better environmental benefit as well. It must perform the same function as the replaced vehicle or a piece of equipment, and it must be scrapped or rendered permanently disabled or returned to the OEM for reman. This is the one that is, don't want to say it's controversial, because this is how Deera has run forever. It is intended to be a replacement program. It is not intended to add to a fleet size. So the requirement is that the equipment or vehicle will be scrapped. So you're taking it to the scrap yard. There's a certification form that you will have completed when it is scrapped. It says, yep, we scrapped it, it's off the road, and here's the proof. Or if you want to keep the piece, and in the non-road sector, this happens a little bit more. Sometimes folks will want to keep the pieces because some of the mechanics have value to them. You can always just drill a hole in the engine block and cut frame rails, and that will actually allow you to maintain ownership of the piece if you want to pull parts off of it. The frame rails cut in half thing is a pretty tricky thing, and I believe there's a reasonable chance that we're going to find a way to maybe get a little creative about that, because I think the thing that really catches me is I think of the fact you're going to scrap a school bus, you've got to cut the frame rails. How do you get it to the scrap yard? And if it's being scrapped as it is, and there's a certification that it has been scrapped, then what is the point of cutting the frame rails? So I mean, there's a little bit of counterintuitiveness in that argument, but we're going to see how that plays out. Everybody's going to play by the rules until somebody points out to the trustee or whoever that maybe there are some issues that we need to address. And then the last thing is evidence of appropriate disposal or scrappage. So if you're doing it yourself, which happens, you know, I've received everything from pictures to videos. I've seen a video of a large non-road piece of equipment. They literally could not drill that 3-inch hole, so they brought in a jackhammer with a cargo moving piece of equipment and just jackhammered a hole into it. And I got the whole video because, you know, why not, right? Next slide. So here's the process that we'll be going through. So I posted the RFP in the spring of this year. Folks will submit the applications in accordance with the requirements and expectations of the solicitation. So how many in here are potential applicants? Okay. So of those who are potential applicants, how many of you have seen the RFP so far? Okay. Because what you'll see when you go into it is that there are kind of pretty clear, yeah, Larry's carrying his around. They're really fond of that. I'm really fond of it too. It only took like two years, it seems, to get there. So it's pretty explicit. It gives you a very clear understanding of what is expected in an actual application for this program. Once we receive those, some item staff are going to review and score and prioritize those. We've got a very robust evaluation criteria that we have developed. The evaluation criteria, I have, from the very beginning of doing this diesel emission reduction programs, I have been an advocate for transparency. So as always, you will know in that RFP, you can see what is the evaluation criteria, what are my targets. You will also see how you could potentially even be scored in it. We've gone to that extent. That I ended up spending an impromptu 45 minutes in Chicago at an EPA meeting talking about that, because most of the states are like, that's a really good idea, but it's hard to get there. The Volkswagen Committee, we're going to make recommendations to them based on the scoring and others. There are quantitative evaluation criteria, which is what I was speaking about just there, but there are also some qualitative things. So for example, if we find that all of the projects are in central Indiana, we may say, you know, that's really not what we intend to happen with this program. This program should benefit the state of Indiana. We've always said it's a statewide program. Maybe there's a project that just was barely below the line for funding, but there's just something that feels really special about this project. There's really a really tremendous impact to some sensitive populations that just didn't show up in the scoring for whatever reason. Maybe we bounced that one up. So those sorts of things. They're going to review the recommendations we make. Together, we're going to identify what projects we choose to fund, and then we'll announce those awards. Now, there's a couple more lines I would add to this, just because there are some applicants in the room. The next steps would be that you and I would make contact. You'd get a letter from me or an email from me or a call from me saying, hey, cool, we want to award you funding from the Volkswagen program in the amount of X dollars to do Y project. Are you interested? You say yes. If you say yes, typically people say yes. Then we will enter the grant process, and that will be me developing a grant agreement that basically is just formalizing our understanding. We're going to give you X dollars, and in return, this is the project we expect you to do. Nothing more, nothing less. No funds can be spent until that grant agreement has gone completely through the signature process, which is now electronic and much more efficient. And it goes completely through the process, and it's signed by the Attorney General's office. So a common question is, well, I just bought these buses or these trucks. Can I use this money to pay for them? Well, no, you cannot. So you cannot incur any costs reimbursable under this program until a date of the AG's office's signature. That's a very important thing to remember. And then from there, we implement a project. So we talked about the evaluation criteria. These are your targets. And what you'll see here is cost effectiveness of the project in a dollar or a cost per ton of NOx reduced. The program is primarily focused on NOx because that was primarily the issue that EPA had with these Volkswagen pieces. And it's a cost effectiveness program. So it's going to be a matter of nothing more than putting data into US EPA's diesel emission quantifier is the model we intend to use. And we're giving you $25,000 for a school bus, let's say. This is what we see as the potential NOx reductions. That scoring method for you right there is going to be the end result of that. How much money do we invest? What are the reductions that we're getting out of that? What is the cost per ton? That's 25 points is the maximum available there. And as you can see, it's the maximum available overall. Transformational potential. When the governor signed an executive order identifying item as the beneficiary as well as naming the Volkswagen committee, the term transformational was used in that executive order, and that has run through this program. Folks are really focused on wanting to have these projects be something that is in some way transformational. That has not really been well defined yet. We think round one might tell us a little bit more, but we do have a scoring criteria that you can take a closer look at to see what that looks like. NOx reduction potential, that's basically the total NOx. That's we put your project in, and these are the lifetime reductions. I believe projects based on project, and pretty sure these are lifetime reductions of the project. So we're going to be able to say this project, if you run, so for example, EPA says a vehicle's typical lifespan is 15 years. It's going to be based on a 15-year cycle. If EPA's DEC system says the typical lifespan of this piece of equipment or vehicle is 12 years, it's going to be based on 12 years of math. Whatever EPA's default is, that's what we're using. And we're using that because not only is transparency really important to me, consistency is almost as important, if not more. And by using EPA defaults that way, we're able to say, yes, everybody's getting treated the same, because it's really easy for one company to come in and say, yeah, we run our trucks for 25 years, and another company to say, we run ours for 12, and realistically, they both run them for 17. So by doing this, we create a level of consistency across that board. 15 points are available for National Ambient Air Quality Standard, sensitive areas as a percentage of current standards. So here in Allen County and in this area, you are currently designated a maintenance area for the ozone standard. So that's what the ambient air quality standard for this area that would be relevant is. So we have a methodology for how we would apply that to certain areas. And that's based on the current air quality standards. That's EPA's designations, if you will, in that regard. Because the next one, air quality benefits to areas with sensitive populations, or bear a disproportionate share of the air pollution burden. This is a pretty interesting metric. And this one, we actually are using a calculation of the, so the first one is kind of a matter of the, you know, instead of trying to walk through this, I'll find out if people are actually interested in this because it gets really complex. And if they are, I've asked Jeremy to kind of have the RFP on the back burner there so we can go to it if folks are interested. If you're not, I'm not going to bore you with it. It's all out there. Leveraging your resources, financial only, in-kind matches, way too hard to really verify. So financial only matches. So for example, if school system A wants to buy a bus, it's a $100,000 bus, we'll give you 25% or 25 grand. That's school system A asking for 25%, but if school system B says, you know, we kind of understand how this RFP thing works. If we actually say we'll pay for 80%, we only ask for 20%, then we're leveraging more of our money to theirs and we're going to score better in this category. You're also going to score better in that first category, right? Because it's less of our money going into the same NOx reductions. So those are the strategies that folks will kind of play. And then the last two are kind of Indiana-specific programs, and that is registered in Indiana Secretary of State, operate vehicles, equipment, conjunction with Indiana facilities. Long story short, these two pieces here, this 5-point category right here is mostly focused on just making sure that it's an Indiana registered piece of equipment. There is equipment that operates a lot in the state of Indiana that isn't necessarily registered in the state of Indiana. We want it to be Indiana registered stuff to the extent that we can, because then we know it's probably staying here. And so there's 5 points available for that. And then the last one is the traditional being an active participant in the MBE, WB, VBE programs. In Indiana, the Department of Administration kind of manages that overall. And that doesn't mean that you need to be an MBE, but if your vendor happens to be, or somebody you're contracting with to do some part of a project happens to be, you know, you could get points there. Not only does the Department of Administration have a program like that, but the Indiana Department of Transportation kind of has their own also. So if you can document that you're going to use somebody on either one of these lists, there's up to 5 points available for you there. So the timeline that we're in now, obviously posted mid-March, proposal deadline mid-June. Roughly a month later, we are hoping that we have worked through the IDEM scoring scenarios, kind of created our recommendations to then hopefully take to the Volkswagen committee in kind of mid-July. Based on schedules that we're already seeing for many committee members, it's possible that might slip a little bit, but that's still the goal we're shooting for. Then within a couple weeks of that, you should be notified, thumbs up, thumbs down on your project. Grant agreements, we're hoping if we stick on this schedule, we're hoping that the grant agreements could be in place by the end of August, which basically that means fully executed. That means the Attorney General is signed and you can spend money. Projects completed, as we said before, in December 2020. What I would say I would recommend is as we get to each one of these steps, the reason I added that accumulated time from posting over there is because we feel that those are pretty reasonable estimates on that side. We still feel the others are as well. But for example, let's say we end up with way more applications than we're kind of planning on right now, and it takes us longer to do a review, prioritization, and get the Volkswagen committee together. So let's say that proposal notification doesn't happen until theoretically the end of August. So let's say 4 weeks later. Well, then you continue to kind of look at, okay, well, then that means 4 weeks after that is when I should be able to expect the grant agreement done. This just kind of work from that column where you need to. And then the last two are not really specifically relevant to now, but things that folks are often curious about. So the Light Duty Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, this is a really, really cool and exciting opportunity that is very complex, and most states are really trying to figure out how best to do this. So what we're going to do, our plan at this point is, in the summer of this year, we're hoping to get together with the Volkswagen committee. We're going to put together a day that'll kind of be hopefully a workshop where we'll learn more about what an EV program should look like. And folks, vendors, and those that have experience in the industry can come in and tell us what makes sense, what doesn't, where you should put your funds, where maybe you shouldn't put your funds. So we're going to start those conversations the summer of this year. And then the Deera option of the Volkswagen program, we're expecting to roll out in the fall of 2019. So the fall of this year is when we expect that to happen. The Deera option is what I would consider to be the flexibility scenario for the non-road sector. So for example, Jeremy, can we bounce back up to the slide that talks about some of the non-road stuff? Keep going, keep going, keep going. Yeah, that's a good one. So you see these where it says all electric. So what the Mitigation Trust did when they wrote the language, they realized that maybe there are places where all electric simply aren't going to work, but they want to encourage that. But in cases where it simply can't work, but they still want to be able to work in these sectors, let's say airport and ports, then they'll provide a little more flexibility. So for example, if you have a 8,000 pound or a 30,000 pound forklift, and you want to use that, and it meets all of these criteria, but there's just no electric alternative out there that can do the job for you, but there is a clean diesel one out there that can, the Deera option provides that flexibility to do things that are a little beyond what the Volkswagen option does. What the Deera option does within Volkswagen, it basically passes the eligibility over to the Deera program. So whatever is eligible under Deera would now be eligible as kind of a combined Volkswagen Deera program. The difference there will be the match percentages that you see here are Volkswagen match percentages. The ones in Deera, in the Deera option, will be based on whatever the match percentage is in the Deera option, in the Deera program at that time. Okay. I think that's pretty much it. Let's go ahead and roll back to the end. I think the next slide is nothing more than that. So we've got a few pieces up here. The Volkswagen Mitigation Trust website, it's a relatively easy URL, or you can just do like I do, even though I somewhat maintain the website. Just Google Indiana VW Trust, and it's like the first or second one, and boom, you're there. Now, we talked about email addresses earlier. So if you have questions, comments, concerns, just hit me up directly at either at the phone or the email address on the bottom. That's cool. But when the time comes to submit an application, that application needs to go to the VW Trusted IDEM email address. All of the applications are going to go there. They're all going to reside there. That kind of becomes the formal portal for these applications. That is all I have in the form of the presentation. So first, let me just ask, what questions do we have? Let's start with questions, and then we'll see if there's a need to go any deeper. Yes.
I'll break the ice. Can't spend money until it's officially awarded. I understand that process. Can an entity enter into a purchasing contract, like encumber funds, send a purchase order for the promise to pay prior to receiving official award?
The way that I would say the language really reads is if you have incurred any costs. So in your case, that's not incurring a cost, that's basically making a promise, right? So that is certainly a viable thing to do. And as a matter of fact, a lot of folks are already starting to do that because they know there's an 18-month lead time now on certain things that they want or need. They're going ahead and putting, reserving that spot at no cost because they've already got a relationship with that vendor. So yes, that's perfectly, not only is that eligible for reimbursement, it's probably a pretty wise approach. Because when everything starts hitting the ground, everybody's going to just be backing up more and more. Anything else?
Yeah, in the non-road categories, is there, I mean, do you have a certain tier that you suspect is more attractive for reducing emissions? Like I know some states, they like, I'm trying to think, some of them like port and cargo handling at the airports because they think that that provides a greater opportunity to reduce some of the diesel emissions. Is that something you're looking at, or is there any area that you think an application would rank higher? So like would airport ground support equipment rank higher than maybe the freight and tugboat or the freight switcher locomotives?
Well, it's a really good question, and there are two answers. One, it's not really something I can or should answer because then basically I'm telling you where to target your applications, right? But what I would say is that there's an easy way for anybody that wants to get to that answer. I mean, if you're a vendor and you know that you could work in this sector or this sector, for example, if you hit the EPA's diesel emission quantifier and you throw your project in over here and then you throw that other project in over there, that's going to give you, why don't we bounce back 2 slides? That's going to give you a feel for how you're going to score in that first category, the 25-pointer, as well as the third category, the 15-pointer, and maybe even to a degree, how you could score in the leveraging of funds side as well, because once again, it's the total emissions is a part of that, okay?
Thank you.
Yep. Anybody else, anything else? Yes.
What's your sense statewide of people plans on overmatching to buy points? Is that something that you're hearing people are likely to do, or we just boycott the whole idea?
The overmatch? I think one of the things that is going to be important in that category, actually, Jeremy, can we bounce that, the RFP up? And then when you do, let's run to, I can't say what page it is, but let's just roll. Okay.
1 second, let me make
No, we're cool.
it's pulled up here. All right.
So let's go, I don't know, let's stay page like 16 for now. Just keep rolling. I'll let you know when to stop. And where we're heading with this is the way in which we grouped. You know, I made the comment, it's actually Appendix A that we're heading for. So whenever you feel like you've reached the end and you're hitting Appendix, there'll be a blank page in between, so that'll make it easy to find. You're getting closer. And keep rolling. Yep, you're getting really close. All right, let's just stop there. So you see the grouping and scoring where it says project grouping, and this comes back to your question, Betsy. I didn't actually forget it. We are going to be scoring like with like, because anybody that's done this at any length of time realizes that a school bus will never compete with a refuse hauler. And if we actually want to have programs that sort of have more sectors engaged, we need to come up with a way to do that. So what you see here is electric school buses are competing with electric school buses, non-electric with non-electric, and then your on-road are all competing against each other. So for example, in the transit bus scenario, you might be competing with Larry next door with his end dumps. So that's where, you know, you have to decide, does that make sense for me? Where I believe, I don't know, but where I believe that is a more likely scenario is going to be in those first 2 categories where you're really competing very much with, I mean, a school bus is a school bus is a school bus. An electric one is an electric one for the most part. They're, you know, just a couple few people that actually are manufacturing these things. There may be an overmatch scenario there because they know that overall, these are almost identical pieces of equipment. So it hasn't been spoken of much. I will say that when I mention it, people's eyes light up like, oh, hey, yeah, that is a way that I could actually improve points in these 3 categories. Because it doesn't just improve in the leveraging category, it can improve also in that first category.
Can you explain what you mean by overmatch?
Well, an overmatch is, so for example, let's use, because they're up here and they're the first one, if we look at A1, which is electric school buses. So an electric school bus, for those in the room that don't know, runs about $400,000. A traditional school bus on the average, depending upon fuel, runs about 100, okay? So, but the difference is in a A non-electric school bus, the program will cover 25%. An electric school bus, it'll cover up to 75. So we'll use electric as an example. So if school system A is asking for 75% and they're only putting up 25% of their money, they're just meeting that requirement. Overmatching is where they say, you know what, we're only going to ask the program for 60% of the money and we're going to increase our match, overmatch the requirement up to 40. That's what an overmatch is. Any other questions that come to mind here? Yes.
So early on, we had been meeting and talking about trying to put together projects that were multiple projects all together, you know, as a package from a community or from an industry. It appears that that's sort of not being encouraged at this point, that it's kind of everyone for themselves. Is that correct?
I wouldn't say it's being encouraged nor discouraged, honestly. It sounds like a bureaucratic or a political answer, but because there are advantages to doing it from the resource standpoint on your end. You know, maybe you have 1 or 2 or 3 people that can put this all together for a handful of places. The challenge that you potentially run into is the program, just like EPA and just like everything else, of course, reserves the right to partially award things. So if you ask for, and I'll use CityLink as an example, if you ask for funding for 4 buses, when we get everything in and we look at this and everybody's asking for, you know, 4, 6, 8 of something, when you put it together as a community, then you've said this is what we want. But when it comes to IDEM, then IDEM is put into position, as well as the Volkswagen committee is put in the position of saying, okay, now we have to pick and choose who's getting what. So the advantage to doing it is on your end, the workload becomes a little easier. The disadvantage to doing it, I guess I would say, is that if there are scenarios where partial awards come into play, you're giving away that opportunity or authority to somebody else where you could potentially make it on your own over here. Does that make sense?
So collaborate, but apply independently.
Well, no, yeah, I mean, sure, you can say it that way. I guess where it's different is so for example, if school systems, like regional school systems were getting together and they were all looking at non-electric school buses, maybe they all wanted clean diesel or they all were moving to propane or whatever, that's a little cleaner than Allen County coming together with CityLink and the city and the county and all these sort of disparate pieces of equipment. It becomes a lot more convoluted. So, you know, if there was another, which there isn't, but if there was another transit agency, for example, that was kind of in this area that you were partnering with, that could make more sense than getting together with, you know, an entire region with a bunch of different pieces and parts, just because it's from a scoring scenario. Then you also, we have not ultimately determined how that might be scored. You know, do we score that project as a whole? And if it was scored as a project as a whole, and you have that really high value project, these lower value projects, so to speak, might bring you down. So, I mean, you kind of have to weigh the pros and cons, you know, independently. Yeah.
Would it hurt to add, is it only for diesel engines or can we add gas engines at the same time?
Gasoline is not eligible.
Not eligible.
Not eligible for, not eligible as the existing, nor eligible as the replacement.
And as a city, and I look at that 25%, okay, and I look at where our residual value would be before we destroy that, and we're pretty much at a wash, okay, of where that value of that truck, if we would send that to an auction, as to put a hole in the block and cut the frame and send it to OmniSource for scrap, we're pretty much at an even match if we're only going to get 25% of that.
Yep.
I mean, makes you wonder if it is worth that, because if there was electrical out there for us in the truck industry right now, or even at the smaller industry of it, it's just not there yet.
Mhm.
It's go fully electric or even partially electric. In a dump truck or even at a lower, if you have to be at a Class 8 GVW, there's just nothing available in a dump truck yet. I know
Right.
Cummins is working on several projects and others are working on projects, but we're looking at $500,000 for that dump truck where you can spend the chassis alone is only $100,000, for example.
Right. No, I get, and that's understood. That's understood across the nation. So yeah, I mean, it's every applicant has to look at it and decide, does this make sense financially? Does this make sense, politically? Because some of these things could be feel-good stories, and yeah, it's a wash, but hey, you got to partner with the program, and you'll get a little PR that'll come along with that probably. Yeah, everybody's got to figure out how they want to handle it. Anybody else?
You talked earlier on about the quantitative versus qualitative side
Mhm.
of the application. I think I have a pretty good feel for the quantitative side.
Mhm.
The qualitative side, what are some things you're looking for there?
Sure. Let's scroll up in the RFP. It will be, it's in the general area of the evaluation criteria box. It's a long list of bullets in that area. Yep, keep going. Up, 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 boom. It's that page right there. These are some of the qualitative things. I'm not going to read all of them to you. You guys can kind of read through what they are. But the one I did reference was we want to have some reasonable geographic distribution, right? Evidence of project implementation feasibility without significant obstacles is the bottom one. And I mean, these are, and what that one means is we know that we're going to see applications that are pie in the sky applications that may never even happen. It happens in pretty much every round of funding. Somebody's got a great idea and they send in an application, but the real world scenario is this project is not likely to happen. This program we don't have the funding to do it. They don't have the funding for their part. So just some of those different things that come into play. There's another one that is, evidence of regional support of a project. If there's like a whole lot of support for you moving your fleet from, the diesel that you have now to, let's say, CNG, and you're getting letters of support from politicians and your MPO and whoever else that's really invested in this transition, those are the things that say, okay, this isn't a one-off project. The region is excited about this. And Carrie, you can kind of help me here. As far as alternative fuels in Northeast Indiana, I mean, are you seeing a lot of CNG yet?
Not in this particular
Right.
area.
Okay. So, and just to give a comparison, the opposite northern corner, CNG is like the hottest thing in the world. And that would be an example of the region has bought into it. So if there's a sense that the region is buying into going in a direction, there's a lot of documented support for that. That's something that we might look at that and say, okay, well, that was down here, but man, Allen County really looks like they want to move in that direction. Let's help them. Okay. Those sorts of things. Does that give you something to go on? And obviously you can go hit it on in the RFP yourself and take a closer look at it.
Part of the infrastructure coming to the CNG in our area, we've looked at CNG at different sites throughout the city of Fort Wayne. And it's the infrastructure that's in the ground that's not there to support. And then they want the individual that's going to build the station to pay for the upgrade to the gas company. They want that person to pay for all the new construction for themselves. Okay?
Right.
So that project that, we can do this. Now the gas company just added another $3 million onto our project. So now it's not cost effective enough for us to move forward with it.
Right.
And it's our own utilities in our area that's hampering us.
Right. Yeah, no, I fully get that. And that is one of the reasons that there are just some places where some fuels, and CNG is the logical one, that there are just places within the state that this makes sense and can happen because there is the underground infrastructure ready for it. But not
Lafayette's a good
everywhere.
one.
Yeah.
Lafayette's using CNG quite a bit.
Right. So the infrastructure is probably there to
It's
support
there,
that
yeah.
already. But up here, it's just not. You just don't have the volume and the capacity, I'm assuming, is the issue, right?
The pressure's not
The
there.
volume.
the
Right.
volume's not there.
Right. So that's, and just like everybody else and like everything else, that's where you're just running your numbers and deciding, can I make a business case for this or not? If you can, then proceed. If not, then you don't.
And we looked at that over 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And again, the utilities have not done anything to upgrade the infrastructure to move forward with that. So we're in a stagnant area.
You seem to be, don't you? Yeah.
So,
I don't have a program for that.
and we're looking to go a different, we will look to go to a whole different other infrastructure because of it.
Yeah. Yep.
We got hybrids, right?
Yeah.
You mentioned about the Deera program.
Mhm.
Because you look at where this scoring is at on this, there's certain projects, and I don't think I'm gonna pull this out of the air. We want to put, and I talked with Mike about this, we want to put a device on our loaders or backhoes to keep them warm and the oil warm so they're not idling.
Right.
Now, that can go through the Deera grant.
As long as it is an EPA verified technology, yeah.
Okay, no, I get that.
Right. Which they would be. And I say, and I guess I should say hesitantly, yeah, because one of the things that has kind of been given, then taken away, then given, then taken away is within the Deera program, the idle reduction technologies. There was a point in time where we could fund idle reduction technologies, and that's all you had to do. I mean, we're throwing APUs on everything out there, bus heaters on everything out there. And then there became a time where EPA said, well, these things actually pay for themselves. They'll do this on their own. Whoa. So they pulled back and they said, well, we'll still fund them, but you have to do A and B also. And a lot of those A and Bs were like put on a DOC if it didn't have it, or a DPF if it didn't have it, and then you can have that too. But most of the equipment already had the first part already in place, so it didn't open it. And as it is right now, just standalone idle reduction technologies are kind of there. We don't know where those are going to play out by the time we get to the fall of this year. There may be a little bit more openness to that than there has been recently.
Is that in the Deera or the
It'd be VW will not change. I would not expect to see anything with VW change, and I would expect to see little things with Deera change on an annual basis. And that's one of the other things I think that's nice about the Deera option is it's a program that is going to change a little every year. And some years maybe it gets better, some years maybe it gets worse, but it's going to change a little bit every year.
Well, on the Deera side, it would be in the construction side. That's what we're looking at.
Right. Well, and the real benefit to the program overall in Indiana for the Deera option is on that non-road side, because most if not all, on the non-road side, the Deera option allows us to do things that don't have to necessarily be in ports, and it allows us to do things that don't have to be electric. So it does give you that level of flexibility. The matches may or may not be as good, but at least it allows you to do a little wider range of project types.
Maybe specific to schools. So
No, that's fine.
it is, but, from a appropriation and cash perspective, so on a replacement schedule for the school, we're going to buy 2 buses a year, right around $200,000.
Right.
If I want to go to an electric bus, let's say, then I need to have $400,000 worth of appropriation, because I understand this to be a reimbursement grant.
Right.
So that's a hurdle for a public entity then, because I have to short my budget someplace
Right.
to gain it someplace else, even though it's gonna be recovered.
That's right. You're moving the money, but then you're moving it back. I get
Correct.
you. Yeah.
So just as feedback.
Oh, no, we get that. And that is one of the, I mean, for those school systems that are interested or intrigued by the electric school buses, that is one of the biggest challenges they have is the financial side. Not only that they have to, set aside significantly more cash for their part, but they also have to, there's sticker shock. I actually received a call from a superintendent saying that they were really excited about electric school buses. And as we were going through the conversation, he said, well, how much do those actually cost? And then when I told him that, he said, okay, maybe we'll go this direction. And there's a place for those. I mean, there's an economy for that somewhere. It's just not everywhere. And that's where folks have to really decide, does this make sense for you?
Yeah, if I can add, yeah, it depends on, right, the fuel type, the infrastructure that's available. And that's what's happening in a lot of conversations I have with people. They may be going one direction, and once we start looking at everything, we look at some other options, and they may switch directions. It just really depends, again, on what you guys are comfortable with and what's available. But there are plenty of options.
Right, and I think one of the things that needs to be really clear, and I think that it's clear in here, this program is you can go from diesel to clean diesel, you can go from diesel to propane, diesel to CNG, diesel to electric, diesel to hybrid. So you can go from a diesel to anything you want to go to. And they're just, we know that there are places where there may only be one viable option. But there are places where there are several options for folks to actually consider. And I'll use the schools as another example for, I referred to the turnover cycle earlier. Within the RFP, and I'm not going to make Jeremy try to find this because I'm not even sure where it's at, but within the RFP, we have a comment that basically says for a piece of equipment, if it is within its traditional formal turnover cycle, it is not eligible under the program. And what the rationale for that is the program was never intended to offset operational costs. It was intended to incentivize earlier introduction of cleaner diesel alternatives, whether they're diesel or whatever fuel they might be. So what we're finding is, so for example, if you are on a 12-year turnover, a 12-year cycle, and you have 4 buses, and are you guys, I'm not going to pick on you, but are you on a 12-year cycle?
10-year, 12-year cycle.
Okay, but so you said 10 or 12. So is yours a scenario where it's really about we're buying X number of buses per year? It's not necessarily about how old the buses are. It's about we're buying 2. So the question that has been raised, and you'll see it in the FAQ on the website within the next, hopefully by the end of this week, maybe early next, is, well, if I have already budgeted to buy 4 buses each year, can I use Volkswagen to buy 2 more? And there are 2 things that come into play. One of them is if those additional 2 are in that 12-year turnover cycle, then they wouldn't be eligible because they are in your turnover cycle already, or they're about to go past your turnover cycle. But if they happen to be 10-year-old and you operate under a formal 12-year cycle, then in that condition, now you're looking at an earlier introduction to a cleaner vehicle, so they would be eligible in that case. So it's about the turnover cycle, not necessarily about the budget and the funding cycle. Does that make sense? Okay.
So in the same line of discussion then of what's getting disabled, okay? I think Carrie and I had this conversation from a school perspective when we met, but we have 14 buses, we have 3 spares that sit in the lot, ready to go if one doesn't start one morning because we got to go pick up the little kids.
Mm-hmm.
So if we're running bus A all year long and going 8,000 miles in a year, we're going to end up, when we buy a new bus, bus A becomes a spare, bus 1 comes in to replace bus A, and we take a spare out of the cycle and either trade it in or disable it at that moment.
Right.
With this process, am I able to take that bus A in that example, the one that was running all last year, and retain it as a spare, take my spare, and it becomes a disabled unit. So I'm still replacing this.
No, I hear what you're saying. Yeah.
But I'm retaining a higher quality spare for the.
Right. And what I would say is in your application, because realistically what you're doing honestly is you're replacing bus B with a new bus. So the challenge that you run into is when you look at the fleet sheet, you're going to identify how many miles these buses are running. And the bus that's on the back lot that's your spare is not running that many miles. So it may not even, so 7,000 miles is the bare minimum. So that bus probably isn't running 7,000 miles a year. So that bus would not actually be eligible for replacement. Does that make sense? Yeah. And of course, understanding that the logic behind that, and once again, it's about being trying to be transparent. The logic behind that is the intent of the program isn't to replace backlot vehicles that aren't even being used. Because in essence, what you're really doing there is you're just adding to somebody's fleet. And there is, you know, there arguably is a net benefit from an air quality standpoint, but from a fleet standpoint, you haven't had the same type of impact you could have.
So Shawn, everybody has to have a spare ratio.
Right.
Or they can't function. And if, in this case, if they're going to take a bus essentially out of service that is running a lot of miles and put a new one in that's going to run a lot of miles, seems like there should be the ability for them. I mean, essentially, they're going to keep a cleaner, most likely a cleaner vehicle, even as a spare, and getting rid of something that's less desirable.
Yeah.
I mean, can they not make that argument in the justification?
Yeah, you know, I don't disagree. What we're looking at, however, is unfortunately what we're looking at is the determination of eligibility more than we're looking at what makes sense sometimes. What I would say, and what I would encourage you actually to do is send an email to me, like a formal question. So I can share that with some of the staff that I work with on this, and let us have a little more thoughtful, longer dialogue on it, because I feel what you're saying. The challenge though is you're realistically replacing this backlot vehicle that doesn't meet the eligibility requirements. So what is a scenario where we can find some sort of a balance there? And I don't know that I'm not saying it exists, but I'm saying that it's worthy of a deeper discussion than you and I can really have right here, right now. Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
The same thing. I mean, we still use those things. It's
Right.
just not what we could consider a mainline truck, but if it's
Right.
snow season or leaf season or certain season, we're going to use that truck. It comes back to a mainline truck. But
Mhm. Yep, I get that.
now, it's not a mainline truck, but
Yeah.
8 months out of the 12, it is.
The net emission gain is that you get a electric vehicle in place of a diesel vehicle in your service fleet.
Mm-hmm. In a scenario like that,
Spare
yeah.
is up to you.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it depends on where you're going, right? You know, I mean, I think you're right, Betsy. I think that's a really fair way to look at it. If you are going from, you know, diesel to electric, then you can say, well, yeah, this argument. But if it's just diesel to diesel and that's what you can do, then it does become a little more complex argument. Anybody else? Anything else?
Can you
Yes.
mention, it's not just CityLink, but I have a couple other transit companies that we work with, and they've been asking about the match for federal transit dollars.
Yes. Good question. For those that actually have federal funding, the question in essence was about using Volkswagen to match funds. And for those that have federal funding, the Volkswagen SEP is not considered federal funds. So it can be used as a match for your federal funding. So in an FTA scenario, you guys are still at 80-20, right? So theoretically, you could use this for 20, you could use that for 80. There are some different thoughts on what that 20 really applies to, whether that 20 should be applying to the total investment, because you've already got that covered. Your actual cost is only this, we'll say $1 million bus. Your actual cost is only $200,000. You know, should it be 25% of that $200,000? That's the fair way to do it.
There's an opportunity cost of using our funds. We're taking something else.
Right, yep. Do you have anything else? I'll give one more example, because I know this has come up in the transit industry, may come up, and I think I've had a similar question from the school bus folks as well. So this program, you know, as it says, it closes at the end of December. The question was, could I theoretically use the program to purchase 2 pieces in 19 and 2 pieces in 20? And what you basically do there are 2 different ways you can go about this. You can either apply in round 1, then apply in round 2, or you can apply for all 4 in round 1. Maybe you're awarded all 4. And if you're awarded all 4, bottom line is you still have until December of 2020 to get that done. So as long as you're, you know, as long as all 4 of those come into your fleet by the end of 2020, it really doesn't matter to us what calendar years or fiscal years they come in, as long as they come in and are delivered by the end of next year.
So if they apply in round 1, there's nothing that keeps them from, say they ask for 4, they get 2, but round 2, they could ask for another 2.
There is nothing that precludes them from applying for funds in the second round. No. What I would say, though, is when folks return to the well, it would be in their best interest to make sure they are making clear, documented progress on their project. Because if it looks like they're just spinning wheels, you know, when round 2 comes, it doesn't make a lot of sense for us to look at round 2 as an award. And you will, you know, from a sort of a reporting, I don't want to call it reporting because I don't consider it that. We are, from a reporting requirement, we as the beneficiary are the only ones that actually have to provide reports to the trustee. Our expectation of you is that you will give us what we need to support those reports, and that's not a whole lot. But what you will get from me on a more or less regular basis is going to be nothing more than an email. Hey, how are things going in the Bluffton project? Where are you guys at? And you know, that will give me some sense of how the projects are going. It also will give us a sense for what really is the build time now for these types of equipment, because we know that's going to get longer, but we don't know what it's going to look like yet. Yes.
Speaking of reports, is there some plan for reporting throughout the lifetime of the vehicle? Will we be sending you things for the next 14 years?
That is not my expectation. Right. Let's see. Yeah, ideally, I might be going by then, but who knows? You know, if I keep having fun, why not? But no, I think that the only thing that we have a requirement within the grant agreement that requires you to own, operate, and maintain these pieces that we're using funding to purchase for 5 years. In my mind, asking you to do these things for that period of 5 years, which is kind of the expectation within the grant, is reasonable. Beyond that, I don't know. I mean, I don't personally see it. I don't.
Once you completed the project, okay, you have that replacement on the road or new piece of project on the road, how else are they going to report onto it? This is just there.
You're estimating the air quality benefit for 12 years.
Right. Well, and we've already done that on the front end, right? When we did the scoring. But what? That's exactly, well, and it's not so much proving it, I don't think, because that gets really complicated. But what is relevant is, are you still operating that vehicle in your fleet? You know, that's important because, and you know, there's nobody here from the refuse industry, right? And I'm not picking on them, but they're just a really typical example of this. So you've got a lot of the Republics and the Best Ways and, you know, the big multi-state organizations that they may move trucks from one state to the next to the next. And, you know, in programs like this, it becomes really important If we're paying for a truck and we say it has to be here for 5 years and we've basically awarded it based on the lifetime emissions of this thing, at a minimum, 5 years from now, that truck better still be running in Indiana and not in Ohio or Illinois or Michigan or someplace else. Transit buses, you all don't move those around as much. Everybody's kind of particular about what they like. Yeah. Well, sometimes they're squares.
Will you be releasing the number of applications received per category? Is that data that will be reported?
There is a transparency requirement. What that's going to look like and how that's going to be presented hasn't really been determined yet, but there will be information out there for folks.
Another good question I keep receiving is there a reimbursement schedule?
Mm-hmm. Yes, you will probably get reimbursed. Actually, we were actually in Chicago last week. The Midwest Clean Diesel Initiative folks were in Chicago last week, and that was, of course, a question that came up because some states are a little farther ahead than others, and some know more than others because of that. And the trustee has up to 60 days to approve. It's called the D3. It's the form there. It's the D4 or one of the others that we send that says, this is the project, it's complete, give them the money. They have up to 60 days to approve that. And it sounds like they have typically been taking that 60 days. Because the trustee is Wilmington Trust, they're a bank. What does a bank think about having cash in the bank? The longer they have it, the better, right? So unfortunately, that's the way it's operating now. It could be that just administratively, they just haven't figured out how to do it quicker. It might get better. But then I have heard that from that point, some folks saw their reimbursement within a week, some was within a month. So it sounds like 90 days is the far outside, but probably somewhere in the 60 to 80 day range is probably the norm. One other thing about reimbursements, I think this is a good point, and I will only speak to what Indiana's plan is as of now. And Indiana's plan is that we don't act as a pass-through for the funds. So what will happen is you all do a project, you submit the documentation back to me. I look through it, I say, yep, everything's cool. I know the vehicle is there, so we're good. I fill out the form, I send it to the trustee. The trustee 60 days later, hopefully sooner, says, yep, everything's good here. And then that reimbursement comes to you. It doesn't come to me and then I bring it out to you. The intent and the plan is that it goes directly to you. Most states wanted to do it that way. Most states have found they've run into some bureaucratic challenges with that. In Indiana, we have not yet. From the beginning, our Office of Management and Budget has basically said, we really don't want to have to deal with it. So we're hoping that it stays that way, but that could change. So I have nothing else to add. If nobody has any other questions.
So the one thing you can replace a diesel with is a diesel.
No.
With anything but gas.
Correct.
And within that diesel, you can replace with CNG.
Right.
Right, that's what he means, yeah.
CNG
Right. Right.
Another item, and it is addressed in the FAQ that's on their website, but one of the things I've been asked about is the percentage of operation time in the state, because we also work with different freight companies. And so in the FAQ, it says that it has to operate 75% of the time in Indiana. And I'm not sure how you want them to document that, but maybe that's something for you to touch on. There's no freight people in here.
That's the expectation. That's about as far as we
But
can
we
go.
will be sending this out, and so that was one of their questions.
Well, I think one of the challenges there, is going to be, how do you enforce that? How do you confirm that? How do they demonstrate that? Depending upon the types of fleets, everybody's got logistics now. Everybody's got GPS on their stuff. So there's a lot of data that you can use to say, yes, yeah, things never left here. That's the obvious stuff. And even, sort of your short and long haul delivery vehicles, same thing. Most of those, especially if they're company owned, they have that same sort of logistics technology, and that's probably what would be relied upon. So you made the comment that there's not a CNG infrastructure as you understand it in the Carmelish area? No. And is it the same issue that Fort Wayne is having?
I don't know.
We got two CNG stations,
At the airport.
and they're both out by the airport, and that line was put in originally to run to General Motors, and the city paid for that line to run to General Motors, and that's the line that they're tapped into. And so that's why both of those CNG stations are out by the airport, close to the airport.
But your understanding is in your area, is it that issue of there just isn't the pressure and the
Oh, I
volume?
don't know.
You just know,
We don't have it. We don't
Right.
have it.
so what I'm hearing you say is there is not a refueling station anywhere close that you know of.
Correct.
That's kind of what you're saying. Not so much that there isn't the capacity for there to be one, just that there isn't currently one there. Okay, good. Because, I run all around the state, so it's good for me to know, okay, so yeah. Well, because I know, your counterpart a little bit to the west, and they actually have that name in their school system, seem to be moving in an alternative fuel direction with their buses, but not that one.
And we have propane.
Right.
I mean, the school has a couple propane buses. We have one propane truck, but
Yeah.
it doesn't get near the mileage
Right.
at all.
I was just gonna, so Greater Indiana is working with NDOT and Office of Energy Development on getting our interstates ready. So if there are any alt fuel infrastructure gaps, we're trying to work with fuel providers and others to make sure that those are getting filled in, so that anyone wanting to use that type of fuel will have that option. Obviously, it takes time to work on these projects and find the funding and the partners, but it's definitely in the plan, and so we've been working with all the agencies, including the MPOs, that serve or cover the area where those interstates are running through. And I have been in communication with City of Carmel, obviously, many times, whether it's Kevin or David, and Carmel seems to be going towards electric. At least that was my impression.
They are, but it's kind of, for us, it's kind of technology not there. but-
For your trucks. Yeah.
And some of the other departments that don't plow snow or big trucks or anything like that,
Yeah.
they're going with.
So then a lot of times what we do is I call it like we're the matchmakers. So whatever type of fuel you're looking at, we find the nearest fuel provider and see what's viable and obviously what isn't. So if that's something you want to look at, I can always follow up with you guys later.
When we've touched on infrastructure just a little bit, so I just want to close one door, not close the door, it sounds harsh, doesn't it? But speak to, in the electric side, the mitigation trust did allow for infrastructure for the transition to electric vehicles. When we went across the state and when we had conversation with the VW committee, it was determined that that was an inequity to the other non-diesel fuel options. It wasn't providing infrastructure cost support for CNG or for propane, and it just created what they felt was an inequity between the fuels. So as such, the Indiana program is focused on the vehicle side, not the infrastructure side. So if somebody moves towards an electrifying their fleet, that infrastructure is going to come on their end. It is not fundable through our program.
They can't pay for a charging station.
Not for the heavy and medium duty, but of course then there's the other side, right? That there's that 15% carve out for the light duty sector, which of course is a completely different, that's transportation, I don't want to say method, but sector, yeah.
Can some of that funds be used in the non-road for a solar canopy charging station for non-road equipment?
Say it again.
So like, let's say an applicant, like just using like Indianapolis Airport, if they wanted to buy a charging station for their airport ground support equipment that's fully electric and it had a solar panel and could charge that equipment, would that be allowed, the funds be allowed to go towards that?
No, because it'd be the same electric support equipment. I'm trying to think, it's the supply equipment. We're not funding the supply equipment regardless of what it looks like. regardless of whether it's renewable or not, because that's still, that, even though that's a really cool concept and really cool program, that doesn't necessarily take away from the competitive disadvantage to the CNG and the propane folks.
So you're saying even in the corridor, that percentage that was put aside for the corridor, that's not gonna be able to be funded for infrastructure that's going down the highways?
No, that's not at all what I'm saying. What he's speaking specifically to the non-road GSE sector. What you're talking about is the light duty sector.
Okay.
That is solely what that is for. Anything else, anybody else? All right, well, I thank you all. Good seeing you again. If you have questions, if you need anything from me, I've got some cards up here. I can pass them out. If you already have my contact information, which many of you do, then you won't need a card. So thank you for coming.
Thanks, Shawn.
Thank you.
Thank you.
There's a lot to cover. All good questions, though.
So the reason I was asking for the GSE reports,